I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture on When Families Disappeared, Camp Shvesters, or Camp Sisters, with Dr. Michael Berenbaum. We're proud to co-present today's program with Project Witness, an organization doing essential Holocaust education work here in New York. The museum and Project Witness work together to organize today's program because we feel it's more essential now than ever to learn and teach about the experiences of Jews, and especially Jewish women, under Nazi rule, both to commemorate their lived experiences and so that we can learn the lessons of their experiences for our world today. In a moment, we'll hear from my colleague at Project Witness, Frida Lashinsky, and then from Dr. Michael Berenbaum. During Michael's lecture, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom chat, or I'm sorry, the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll include as many as we can in a Q&A portion at the end of the program. Without further ado, I'll hand things off now to Frida Lashinsky.
Thank you, Ari. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for your patience while we are going through some technical difficulties. My name is Frida Lashinsky. I'm the program coordinator of Project Witness. On behalf of Ruth Lichtenstein, the founder and director of Project Witness, we'd like to welcome you to Dr. Michael Berenbaum's presentation of When Families Disappeared, Camp Shvesters or Sisters. We are proud to join the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, in hosting today's lecture to you. Today's topic delves into the bonds that were formed between women in concentration camps, which often help them survive the most unimaginable and impossible circumstances. We're very excited for Dr. Berenbaum's fascinating lecture, so let's get started. Dr. Berenbaum, a world-renowned historian, is the director of Sigi Ziering Institute and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in LA. He was the project director overseeing the creation of USHMM and was the first director of its research institute. He later served as its president and CEO of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, which took the testimony of 52,000 Holocaust survivors from 57 countries. His work in film has won both Academy and Emmy Awards. Dr. Berenbaum was the author and editor of 22 books, scores of scholarly articles, hundreds of journalistic pieces, and was the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He won the Simon Rockower Memorial Award of the American Jewish Press Association 3 times in 3 categories over 2 years. Dr. Berenbaum is a dear friend and consultant to both the Museum of Jewish Heritage and to Project Witness. It is my true honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Berenbaum.
Thank you very much, Frida. I have to apologize to everyone. I have been having technical difficulties this morning. Somehow, between 2 computers and an iPhone, we've barely been able to connect. So we've been barely able to connect, and consequently, we had some difficulties, so I apologize for the delay. Being that and being formerly from New York, I can speak quickly, which will allow us to cover the material. Let me first thank my the people who have invited me, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, which I have worked with, and also my colleagues at Project Witness, which I've also worked with and enjoyed my association with both institutions. Let me begin the long way about, and that is, let's begin by talking about how the subject of women got introduced to Holocaust studies and what the evolution has been, and therefore what we've learned about the experience of women in particular, and then talk about what is unique to the woman's experience within the Holocaust. It doesn't take much to imagine that the issue of feminism and feminist studies had been coming forward with regard to every field of human endeavor. And it also came forward very strongly with regard to the Holocaust. That originally led to a tremendous clash. And the clash was, wait a minute here, you're talking about women, but the reason that the women were killed was because they were Jews, and we can't distinguish between the victim groups of Jews on the basis of gender. and don't use the Holocaust to verify or to make particular claims about gender theories and about feminist theories, and it's a misuse of the experience. I had also a particular experience with that in three ways. I refereed one of the earliest books on women and the Holocaust and found that it was describing a phenomenon of victimization without describing anything else that was involved in the experience and touching on some of the unique dimensions of the woman's experience, and asked that essentially, in addition to all of its major chapters, it begin to consider certain other issues. The second thing that happened is I published with my friend John Roth a wonderful volume called The Holocaust's Philosophical and Religious Implications. The volume was intriguing because it developed over an evening's conversation in which we both bemoaned a problem that we had, which is in those days we had to copy everything that we were looking for, because there was no one place to find some of the major essays on the Holocaust. We started talking and we went through what we considered the major essays on the Holocaust, and we discovered that we had redone, essentially, we had used in our teaching 15 of the same major essays, and therefore we decided, let's make a book out of it by collecting these essays and bringing them together. My friend Carol Rittner, who's a religious sister of mercy, both a Roman Catholic nun and a very fine Holocaust scholar, looked at our collection of essays, and we noticed one thing when we collected these essays. We noticed that half the people on the cover had taken their own lives. And that frightened us in terms of one aspect of studying the Holocaust, because it meant that when you come close to this material, it exacts a price, and very often it exacts a very heavy price on those who work with this material. Carol noticed something very different, and that is she noticed that we had almost no women in the discussion, and that our use of testimony did not bring any women's testimony. And as I like to say, that gave rise to a very important collection of essays called In a Different Voice, Women and the Holocaust. And Carol wrote that book, edited that book with my colleague, John Roth. And I discovered something after that, which is that I had not included in the very important canon of Holocaust literature, I had not included the voice of women, and I had to begin including the voice of women. A third thing happened, which is that I had started paying attention in listening to oral histories to the unique perspective of women. And consequently, it began to transform and change a good deal of my understanding of how I read Holocaust literature and how I understood the event themselves. Over time, the rift between those who had a feminist perspective, or let me say, a feminist orthodoxy, and those who were Holocaust historians, Holocaust literary figures, and these are some of the giants of the field, including people like Lawrence Langer, began to narrow tremendously as we began to understand that we had to look at the totality of human experience. And the totality of human experience differentiated in, not differentiated, it included some aspects of the experience that were unique to women. So let me give you a summary paragraph or two on what we say is unique to women, and then let's take through some of the testimonies as we understand them. Number one, we have to say that more women were killed than men. Let me document it in a very particular way. Number one, women during the beginning and of the evolution of the Holocaust, some men thought that the Nazis would target only men and that the Nazis would not go after women and children. And consequently, many men escaped in order to protect themselves, thinking that by that they were also protecting their families. Lo and behold, that what happened they could not imagine, which is that they escaped into freedom, and men and women and children were left to be victimized. Women in particular, therefore, were murdered more in greater numbers than men. You all know that at the selection at the ramp, and that is the moment after arrival, the groups were divided. Men were on one side, women and children are on the other. And they were divided into groups of 5 before they underwent the selection. And it was automatic that women with children were sent to their death. That meant that if you take the population that has children under the age of 14 or 15, meaning those who could not pass for being over the age of 16, which was the quasi-demarcation point for selection, those women with young children were sent to their death. Their husbands and their older sons had a greater probability, not a great probability, but a greater probability of surviving. Consequently, more women turned out to be victims than men. And we see that in the numbers killed, and we see that in the extraordinary experiences that women had. Let's now talk about, for a moment, some of the unique experiences of women. Let's turn to a very important moment in which women showed a tremendous amount of resiliency and a tremendous amount of creativity, imagination, and daring. You all know that between 1933 and 1938, a family had to make a difficult decision if they were in Germany. And that is, the decision is, do we leave or do we stay? And the question of do we leave or do we stay is an intriguing question, because it means what's the moment at which you give up everything you have and you go into the unknown, because you understand that the situation is deteriorating and it's getting terrible. And keep in mind something else, which is that, and I want to use an analogy. If you put a frog into water and you heat up the water gradually, the frog will stay and be cooked alive. If you drop a frog in, and I'm not, God forbid, suggesting this, if you drop a frog into boiling water, it will jump out immediately. Meaning, if the situation gets worse dramatically, immediately, and it becomes clear to everyone that it's intolerable, then a whole range of people have the possibility of leaving, and they take the steps necessary to leave. If the situation deteriorates slowly, then it takes a certain different measure in order to leave. Walter Lacour once said it in the following way, if you want to crystallize it. The late Walter Lacour of blessed memory said, "The pessimist left, the optimist died." Meaning, if you said the situation is bad and it's getting worse and tomorrow will be worse than yesterday, you took the steps that were necessary to leave, however difficult they were, and I don't want to minimize how difficult they were. And if a little bit, you said, I believe that the German people will come to their senses. I believe that the Allies will not allow this to happen, that a whole range of things will take place. And you were optimistic, or for example, in Hungary, that it's not going to happen in Hungary. Then you stayed, and very often you stayed until it was too late. What is the moment at which German Jewish women showed their capacity was a very intriguing moment after the November pogroms, November 1938 pogroms that are known as Kristallnacht. And the reason I used the 1938 pogroms is in contemporary German history, they believe that Kristallnacht, which was a term invented by the Nazis, the night of broken glass, crystal, and crystal is supposed to be beautiful and fragile. Crystal glass, the night of the broken glass, is to beautify an event that was horrific. And they now call it the 1938 Reichspogroms, the pogroms being a word that is well known in Jewish history, and therefore descriptive of an event that is episodic horror, in which the police were either perpetrators or bystanders, and in which the mob ruled. You know that more than 1,000 synagogues were burned, 7,000 businesses were looted and destroyed, and 30,000 men aged 16 to 60 were arrested. That's a moment in which, if you think of the question of optimist, pessimist, and you think that your husband, your son, your brother, your father is in a concentration camp. And at that point, if a man was in a concentration camp, if a Jewish man was in a concentration camp and he would could prove that within a fortnight he would leave the country, it was possible to get out of the camps. That was a window of opportunity in 1938 and 1939 that closed very quickly. And once the window of opportunity closed very quickly, then it was impossible to get out. But in November 1938 and early 1939, if you could leave and prove you could leave, that's the moment in which you could get out of the concentration camp. Once your husband, your son, your father, your brother was in the camp, then Jewish women, and it was only Jewish women because there weren't adult Jewish men around at that point, only Jewish women, began the enormously Herculean task of finding a place to go, the means by which to buy tickets and to get a visa out, to beseech the authorities in order to prove that you could get out of the camp of the country. And they moved heaven and earth, essentially because they had no other alternative but to move heaven and earth. They moved heaven and earth in order to what? To get their husbands out. So that's one of the areas in which we see a tremendous amount, and one must pay attention to the tremendous amount of innovation, of creativity, of imagination, of discipline. And many of these women were assuming financial responsibilities for the family for the first time. And this event was restricted primarily to German and Austrian women whose husbands' fathers, sons, and brothers were arrested. And it's a tremendous amount of innovation and creativity. And I want to teach you a phrase that I learned from a former director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. David Marwell said, just because the Jews were powerless did not mean that they were passive. And that becomes an important modality to which you see how they used whatever limited capacity they had in order to get their husbands free and out, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers free and out of Germany. Let's now go to the second moment in which women's experience differed significantly from men. And let's particularly deal with religious women for a moment. We're now moving not into the buildup to the Holocaust, the years 33 to 39. We're now dealing in 1939 onward, and most especially in the question of can you hide? And that involves ghettoization. It also involves escape from the mobile killing units and the question of can you hide? You have to understand that in Eastern Europe, many Jewish men from religious families went to Jewish schools in which they studied Limudei Kodesh, in which they studied Jewish learning, and they had less secular skills and less command of the secular language, of the native language of their land in order to survive. Jewish women, for the most part, with the exception of the Beis Yaakov women, Beis Yaakov girls, we can say at that point, essentially went to public schools, and the older women who had functioned before there was Beis Yaakov went to public schools, and they had a greater native command of the language, and they also had, therefore, spoke the language without an accent. In order to hide, you needed there were two types of hiding. Hiding number one was trying to pass as a non-Jew, and for that you needed language skills. For that you needed a certain measure of looks, or else to dye your hair blonde, as it were, under the myth that the Aryans were blonde and blue-eyed, the Jews were dark-haired. Not really the truth, but we'll stick with the myth for a moment. And you needed linguistic skills in order to function. The second means of hiding was to hide clandestinely, which depended on finding somebody who would hide you and not appearing in public and the like. And that was the alternative to ghettoization, or very much the alternative to the mobile killing units and being victimized, as the mobile killing units in 1941-42 went from town to town, village to village, hamlet to hamlet, and killed Jewish men, women, and children, bullet by bullet by bullet. And the only alternative to that was to find a place to hide. It was significantly easier for women to find a place to hide, even though that they had that extra special vulnerability because they were women and could be violated, because they had greater linguistic skill and very often had greater knowledge of the non-Jewish community than did the religious Jewish men who had studied in Jewish school with fellow Jewish students and who therefore had less able skills in order to at least survive by hiding. There's another aspect of ghetto life which we don't necessarily appreciate fully, and that is that if the man was defined by work, the loss of job left a measure of greater responsibility on women in order to function in the ghetto. And they very often had to assume primary responsibility for the family. And we hear this again and again and again in testimony. We also know that in contacts between ghettos, women were used as couriers They were the link between ghettos, and the reason they were the link between ghettos is because A, they had linguistic skills, and secondly, for a very basic reason, which is their Jewish identity could not be determined in the same way that a man's Jewish identity could be determined by the Brit Milah, by the circumcision. And consequently, they were part of the great network that was used to connect ghettos and therefore to have greater information. Let's now move for a moment to camps and understand this. We spoke before about the fact that women who arrived with children were sent immediately to their death. You also have enormous, any number of examples. And let me give you two that I've heard from testimony, even in recent weeks. Cecile Klein arrived in camp with her mother and her sister. And her mother said to her upon arrival, almost intuiting what was about to happen, "Give me the baby, because they will treat women with children better than they will treat an old woman like me if I'm alone." And she had her two younger daughters who were in the age where they would be selected to work go on, and she took the grandchild, she took her anicle, and the bubby took her anicle and marched to her death. The mother was then forced to live with the consequences of the fact that her mother, on the one hand, saved her life, and on the other hand, she separated herself from her child. And that became enormously, as you can imagine, psychologically burdensome and difficult for the remainder of her life. Another woman, her son describes the experience. There was a woman in the train with us who had 3 children, all under the age of 5. And my mother turned to her and said, "Look, let me give you a hand and help you with the child." And she came off the train with the child in her arms. And consequently, she was marched to her death with the child, where, given her age, I was a 13-year-old boy, my mother was under 35. My mother could have possibly survived had she come off the train without volunteering to what? To carry another child. In camps themselves, in the concentration camps, there are a couple things we have to say. I'm going to be, number one, women testify repeatedly to something that is not true. And this had an impact in the post-war years enormously, which is they ceased to menstruate. And they presumed that the Nazis put something in the food that forced them to cease to menstruate. We now know biologically that the pressures, the enormous pressures of lack of food and tension caused a cessation of menstruation. And therefore, one of the important questions that women had throughout the camps is, will I ever be able to give birth? And that's one of the reasons that immediately after the war in the displaced persons camp, the Jewish response to death was to recreate life. Part of that was an instinctive sense of the last word in Jewish life cannot be, in the Jewish history, cannot be death, but life itself. But the second is many women were desperately afraid that they would never again be women. Now let's talk about the notion of camp sisters. Women developed, and you must listen to hundreds of testimonies in order to understand it. Women developed a network of mutual support in the camps, and they use a couple of words. They use camp sisters and camp mothers. The Yiddish for camp sisters is Shvesters. And let me describe it to you in one woman's testimony, which you can see in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I had a comrade, a friend in camp. We became sisters. We shared everything. And then she goes on to say, we shared all of our food. If we got one piece of food, we split it. And she said, even with soup, we ate the soup together. But then she said something else. I am certain that she never took an extra drop of soup, splitting the bowl of soup in half. But I'm equally certain that she never left an extra drop of soup that was not going to be hers. In other words, we split it 50-50. We split it up in a very basic way so that it was guaranteed. Another group of women described the following, that whatever we got, we split. And in order to make sure that when you cut something, you cut it as equally as imaginable, we developed a system where we had straws. And so one person cut the food, and we each had a straw, and then we picked the portion number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, based on the straws. And since we never knew whose portion it would be, we understood that somebody tried to divide it as equally as possible in order to be fair and in order to develop what we would call mutual support. Let's take a second example. This is a survivor from Skokie, Illinois, who recently died. She was also a survivor who had a very unique experience, of which I only know of one moment in time in which this happened. And that is, she was in a gas chamber crematoria in the undressing room on October 7th, 1944, when there was an uprising in the Sonderkommando in the vicinity of the gas chambers. And what did they do? They then brought the women back from the gas chamber, and they came back into the barracks, and that was not supposed to happen. I have heard testimony from about 5 women who were part of that experience, and consequently, they are the only people we know who went into the gas chamber and came out, precisely because of the fact that it was the Sonderkommando that engaged in an uprising at Crematoria 2 on October 7th, 1944. They were ironically helped by 4 women who brought to them some gunpowder, which could be used for explosives when they set the crematoria on fire. And these 4 women were killed on January 6, 1945. Among them were Rosa Robota and Esther Saperstein and the like. And Rosa Robota's last word, she was a young woman from Chekhanov, and her last words was Chazak ve'amatz, be strong and of great strength, which are ironically the words in the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu used when he spoke to Joshua. When he spoke to Joshua and he gave him responsibility for the future of the Jewish people. Fritzi Fritzell says that she was the youngest in the barracks. She was about 15 years old. She was the youngest in the barracks. And she said, therefore, I had 800 mothers, everyone who was looking out for me, meaning that they felt that they couldn't save everyone. They couldn't go out of their way to provide for everyone, but they could go out of their way to provide for someone. And the way in which they sustained their humanity, was by providing for one person, the youngest person in the lot. And therefore she was taken through and able to come out of it. So women in the camps had a much greater social support network of mutuality than we hear in male testimony. And it could either be that the women speak of that because it was so important, or that men had less and therefore were reflecting their own experience of greater isolation when they were in camps themselves. Let's now talk about marriage in the ghettos, and I'm going to use two examples of marriage in the ghetto. One is an example of testimony by a woman by the name of Helen Kay that was taken at Yale. And this is what we would call a marriage of survival and marriage of safety. Helen Kay was a very beautiful young woman, and her parents said to her, "We want you to marry the wealthiest man in the ghetto." Who was the wealthiest man in the ghetto? You didn't have Rockefellers in the ghetto. You didn't have Bloombergs in the ghetto. The wealthiest man in the ghetto was the baker. Why was the baker the wealthiest man in the ghetto? Because if there was any food to be had, the baker had food. And the baker was first able to provide for himself and for his family with regard to food. And food was the single most valuable currency you could have, both in the ghetto and in the camps. So she ended up marrying the baker. It was a marriage of what you would call survival. There's a second story of survivors whom some of you know, which is the story of Ben and Vladka Mead. Vladka Mead, who was Feigl Lepetl, and whose nom de guerre was Vladka, tells the following story about how Ben and Vladka became, quotation marks, boyfriend and girlfriend. Vladka was working in the underground, and being a redheaded woman who did not particularly, quotation marks, look Jewish, she was working on the Aryan side, and she was sent in order to buy arms and also to smuggle out information. The most important piece of information she ever smuggled out was a map of Treblinka, and a map of Treblinka with the knowledge that Treblinka was a death camp, and with the knowledge that there were people that essentially in Treblinka there was no selection, there was merely annihilation. And one can say that of all the Jews who arrived in Treblinka, 99.999% were killed. The best way to put it is 925,000 people were killed at Treblinka. There were less than 100 known survivors. And some of you who are more skilled at math can give me the numerical calculations of that. Vladka says the way Ben became my boyfriend was as follows. And this is a couple who was then married for 50 some odd years. Ben became my boyfriend because I said to him, I'm going somewhere and I don't know if I'm coming back. My father is gone. My mother and my brother are gone. Her mother and her brother had reported for deportation to Treblinka because they promised somebody who reported to Treblinka that they would give them a piece of bread and some marmalade. And even if they knew they were going to an unknown place, not necessarily death, they understood that they were so desperate for a piece of bread and marmalade that they reported to the death. She turned to him, if I don't come back, I want someone to care. Therefore, you can be my boyfriend. Ben's mother and father understood what was happening with this couple. And Ben's mother took off her ring and took a glass of water and said, Binyamin, give this to Vladka, which he did. She lifted her glass of water and she said, Soll sein mit Mazel, let it be with luck. And that's the way in which they had their first of several wedding ceremonies. They later were married by a rabbi under chuppah and kiddushin. But that's an example of marriage. It's an example of what we would call the marriage of desperation, but also a love that was born of desperation and a marriage that was born by a love that was forged in desperation. There's going to be a book coming out in the next couple of months, which is going to describe the various ways in which people found each other and married each other, in order to show that not every experience of male-female relationship was one of violation and taking advantage of, but there were a whole range of other examples of what happened. Let's now talk for a moment, because we want to leave time for questions and answers. Let's talk for a moment about the post-war in a very important way. The experience of women in the post-war situation was also unique. First of all, there was a tremendous sense of isolation. There was also a tremendous fear that they could no longer give birth, that they had been deprived of their womanhood and of their capacity. There also was a very important rabbinical question that had to be raised in a very dramatic way, which is that normally, in order to remarry, if a woman had been married, you needed a witness to the fact that the man had been killed or had died. Normally, a death certificate suffices in that, and then the woman is free to remarry. The problem is that if you went to Treblinka, 25,000 killed, less than 100 known survivors. How do you know if your husband was not among those survivors? And how do you know that he ended up being killed? If you went to a place like Belzhitz, 500,000 killed, 2 known survivors. Therefore, interestingly enough, in both Belzhitz and in Treblinka, there was very little known about the camps till much, much, much later, because unlike Auschwitz, there were very few survivors who could testify to what happened in the camps. And there was a tremendous effort by the rabbis to find a means in order to free these women and allow them to remarry. And one of the most important rabbinic deciders was a man by the name of Rabbi Meisel, who himself was a survivor of Auschwitz, and therefore understood precisely the questions that had to be asked in order to allow for marriage to take place. The point we want to make also is that in the DP camps, there was a dramatic return to life. First of all, people got married. Sometimes they got married out of love. Sometimes they got married out of loneliness. I heard the following testimony. I'm all alone, I have no one. You're all alone, you have no one. let's be alone together. But out of that, there was what? Out of that, there developed a long-lasting and a happy marriage, but it was a marriage born of despair and of isolation. And then women dared to do something which was to my mind, the most courageous, but in one sense, unimaginatively bold decisions to make. And that is before they knew where they were going to be, before they knew how they were going to create their life, before they knew that the world would be safe for them. They dared to have faith in the future and to bring a young child into the world. And because these were Jewish children, when they were boys, they dared to circumcise them. And that in a very real sense is something we don't particularly think is anything other than the most ordinary thing in our world. But in that world, after 6 years in which if a man was asked to lower his trousers, he was dead, to bring a child into the world and to make an indelible sign of the covenant on that child, on that boy, was an act of enormous courage, which took place and which is an indication of an indefatigable spirit, of Jews to answer death by recreating life. Let's leave it here for a moment, take your questions because we've gone on, and I'm going to hear from Ari, and he's going to field the questions, please.
Michael, thank you so much for that very interesting lecture. To our audience, please feel free to share questions in the Q&A box. We'll start with some of the best questions that have come in so far. Michael, there's a question from an audience member named Sheldon about national differences between women's experiences, Polish Jewish women, German Jewish women, Russian Jewish women. How might you answer that? And I'm curious about the way that those differences manifested in each of the chronologies that you've discussed.
Well, we can not only say that there may have been national differences, there may have also been differences between urban and rural. I can say that the first thing is that if you had to hide, or if you had to go out into the forest, if you had to forage, women who grew up in a rural environment had better skills at that and better knowledge of it and a greater ability to get by. Let's begin by talking about the difference between German women, Polish women, Hungarian women, and Russian women. And by the way, Russian women, we're really talking about people that in what was the old Soviet Union. German women had a buildup of 6 years in order to understand the Nazis. And the buildup of 6 years meant that they had lots of decisions along the way that they had to grapple with. And remember that the bulk of the German Jewish population left Germany before the Holocaust. Most German Jews were refugees. And sometimes I'll tell a story I know very personally. There was a great Jewish philosopher of education by the name Mike Rosenak. Mike Rosenak was the first person in the community in which I grew up in, who made Aliyah. He made Aliyah in 1956, 57. And it was a symbol to us of somebody. His father was a very famous lawyer who was enormously influential in getting Jews to get out. And his mother went to his father one day and she said, I have a woman with a child whose husband refuses to leave because he thinks he's doing something very important. And can you help the woman to leave with her child because she doesn't want her child to grow up like this, doesn't want her child to be subject to this, doesn't want to continue to live like this. So he said, please do me a favor, give me the woman's name, and of course I'll be able to help her. So she spelled out her name, but used her maiden name. And he looked up from his desk and she said, it's time, and we're out of here. And she said, we're out of here with you, or we're out of here without you. Let me give a second example of a choice that the German women had to make. German, and by 1938 it was included Austrian women and some Czech women had to make, which is the great act of rescue of 10,000 Jewish children, called Kindertransport. But remember, Kindertransport means that the British had to decide that were willing to receive 10,000 children, which they did after Kristallnacht. By the way, the Americans refused to receive 20,000 children and follow the British example. The problem was that these children would grow up to be adults and they would take American jobs. And that it was called the Wagner-Rogers Bill. It didn't even get out of committee in the United States Congress. These women had to make a decision that they loved their children so much that they were willing to give them up, to let them go into the arms of strangers. They had to make a decision that they couldn't protect their children, and the situation was so desperate that they loved their children so much that their children would be better off living without them than staying where they are. 10,000 families made that decision. So imagine what they perceived, what they felt, what they sensed in order to understand that. Let's talk, for example, about Hungarian women. Hungarian women, and remember, the whole Hungarian story is intriguing because the whole Hungarian story occurred only after March 19th, 1944. Germans invaded March 19th. Ghettoization took place in April and May. Deportations occurred between the 15th of May and the 8th of July. And by the 8th of July, deportations had ended. And then all that was left was the Jewish community of Budapest, because the entire countryside had been rid of the Jews. So the question became for Hungarian women, how do you survive a year? Because again, everybody knew by the time of the Hungarian, and this is what gives you the sense of the Nazis' priority, everybody knew that by the time Hungary was invaded, that Germany was going to lose the war. Soviet Union was advancing. The Allies had gone up from North Africa. They had entered Italy. We didn't yet know about D-Day, but D-Day occurred about halfway through the deportation of Hungarian Jews. And consequently, their experience was, how do I hold out until the war comes to an end? And that's an incredible story in and of itself. Soviet Jewish women faced the question of how do you deal with these murderous rampages that were taking place of mobile killing units. By the way, in Lithuania, 2 out of 3 Lithuanians were killed by Lithuanians, not by Germans. In Latvia, the same percentage. In Estonia, 100% were killed by Estonians, not by Germans. So the question becomes, how do you hide? How do you escape? How do you get out of there? How do you do? And then you also have another piece of interesting evidence that's being drawn up now by a man by the name of Patrick Dubois and his group, which is they are now going to the mass killing fields, digging up graves and finding out essentially that some of these people do not have, some of these skeletons do not have bullet holes in them, which means that you had fathers that stood in and took a bullet for their children. You had mothers who protected their sons and daughters. Their experience was very different. And their experience was not one of concentration camp, was not one of when do we leave, but was question of how do we hide. In Poland, you had essentially ghettoization, deportation, concentration camp. You also had instances of resistance. And remember, in resistance, women and men fought alongside each other, and women performed the great task of being couriers and arms merchants. Latka Mead herself climbed over the Warsaw Ghetto wall with dynamite, understanding that if she jumped or if they shot at her, she could be exploded because she was carrying dynamite. And what did she know about dynamite? She said, I couldn't even pronounce the word. So there are clearly geographical differences. There are also differences between peasant and urbanite women. You also had a cultural divide between those who had been around farms and animals and death and dying in a way that's different. That's how I can give it as a short answer. Let's take the next question.
Thank you, Michael. And I appreciate everyone's patience. We're going to run a couple minutes late since we started a few minutes late. Michael, let's try to fit in 2 more questions. There are several audience members asking about the sexual violence that Jewish women experienced, both from Nazis and also sometimes from Russian soldiers. Did you find that that was something most women were willing to speak honestly about in their testimony?
Look, there are a couple of points at which people boil up. Let's begin by saying that the sexual violence that women experienced from Russian soldiers was not particularly directed at Jewish women. It was directed at all women, and it was directed at women of all ages. And that's an incredible thing to see. It gave the Russians a horrendous reputation among everything. The violence directed by the sexual violence directed by Nazis against Jews is seldom spoke of on either side, because for the Nazis, it was a violation for the most part of the Aryan laws with regard to sexual relations between Aryans and Jewish women. And for the Jewish women, it was a violation, an incredible violation. Let me tell you one story which I heard not from the woman, but I heard from a rabbi. The rabbi was a rabbi in Nashville, Tennessee. I won't give the year. And he said a couple came to me to get married. And I met with them. We spoke at great length. It was a joyous event. And then the man left and the woman said, Rabbi, I'd like to see you alone. And he said, okay. She said, I can't get married. And then she lifted up her blouse and showed him that she had been tattooed between her breasts. And that is that she had been used as a what the Japanese referred to as a comfort woman in forced sexual violence in one of the camps. And the rabbi was absolutely startled, obviously never happened to him before. And he said 3 things that were incredible. He said, number 1, you must get married. Number 2, if you want me to talk to your husband, I will be the one to talk to your husband to be. And number three, I will insist on your tuba that we write Betulta. And that is that we treat you as if you have never been married, never been touched. And when he recited this to me, he had tears in his eyes. And he said, I know I did right. But that gives you an example of it. We are now hearing much more. Interestingly enough, there are two things that we hear about at the end of testimony, very often when they ask us to turn off the cameras. We hear of two things that are very difficult to talk about, almost impossible to talk about. We hear about sexual violence and sexual violation, not only of women, but also of men. And we also hear of something else, which is we hear of the occasions of cannibalism. And people to this day, that's a part of memory they can't go to. There's a fellow who just gave his testimony in one of these holograms that are being used by the Shoah Foundation. You had it at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And he said, I was the boy for the capo. He said, and psychologically, I understand by all that I've learned elsewhere that I must have been violated. But I can't remember anything about that. Anytime I go into the privacy of the capo's room in the barracks, I go blind.
Thank you for those stories, Michael, which give me the chills. I want to ask you one more question if you have the time. Someone in the audience named Geraldine's mother was a Camp Shvester or sister and experienced these networks of women supporting each other. She's asking whether the Camp Shvesters whose stories you've heard stayed close to each other or stayed sisters after the war.
I can't give a general answer to that, but I can only say that they had seen each other at their most vulnerable. And consequently, everything else in life was, relatively speaking, easy. They also understood that when push came to shove, there was nothing that they would not do for each other. And if you think of that as a quality of human relationship, you don't know that about many people. You can count on many of us can count on one hand, perhaps, if we're lucky, that we know that about anybody, about other people, and other people know that about ourselves. Those type of friendships that are forged in fury and forged by fire and by flame and by desperation and by everything else, those don't happen easily and lightly. So that's the best answer I can give. And remember, some of these women ended up in Australia, some ended up in New York, some ended up in Canada, some ended up in Israel, and some remained for whatever reasons behind the Iron Curtain. So whether an individual was close to a Camp Shvester for the rest of her life depended in part on circumstances. And some became inseparable. Some became absolutely inseparable. Let me close with one more story, which I didn't get to. And I want to do this for my most especially the people in Project Witness, there's a word that I kept hearing in women's testimony called dafka. Dafka is a Hebrew word and a Yiddish word, which means nevertheless, despite everything. You know, absolute, several women I've heard described, for example, fasting on Yom Kippur. And they said dafka. We fasted on Yom Kippur, not particularly because, because we fasted every day in Auschwitz, but we fasted to show ourselves and to show them, even though they wouldn't be impressed by what we were showing them, that even there Jews could maintain tradition. Even there Jews could be faithful to a God. And you have another number of examples. You have a group of secular girls, quasi-secular girls, who were in a slave labor camp, who specifically took the fat that they could get in order to create a little bit of wax and lit Hanukkah candles. And they again used the word dafka. And that's a spirit of defiance, which in part showed their humanity, but strengthened their humanity. And all of that helped people to survive. And in this case, helped people to survive as Jews.
Michael, when we hear from you, the rabbi and the doctor in your title both come through so clearly. It's a joy and a privilege to learn from you. So thank you for being with us today. Well, Michael, I'm not sure if you could hear me, but I was just saying that we're deeply grateful for you sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining the Museum of Jewish Heritage and Project Witness for Michael's lecture today. Everything both of our organizations do is made possible through donor support. So we thank those of you who are already generously supporting our work. And if you're not and you're interested, you can find links to both of our organizations in the Zoom chat. I share my thanks once again, and I'll hand it off to Frida Lashinsky to close today's program.
Thank you very much, Ari. And thank you, Dr. Berenbaum, for that enlightening, important, and extremely moving lecture that I know will definitely stay with me for a long time. And I could safely assume that it will stay with everyone in this audience for a very, very long time. It was just absolutely spectacular. On behalf of Project Witness, we thank the museum for co-hosting this event with us, to Dr. Berenbaum, to Ari, to everyone involved for everything that you do for Holocaust education. We thank each and every one of you for joining us today, for your continued participation, and please continue to participate in these types of programs, that we can continue offering these types of programs for you in general. Thank you all for joining. Stay safe, stay well.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.